Hi everyone. Today's lecture is going to be about neoclassical organization theory. A quick review of classical organization theory from last week. Remember, um, it, it, uh, guys like Taylor, Max Weber, and other sort of classical organization theorists were sort of learning to apply sort of scientific thinking to the behavior of organizations, and the things that they concluded were sort of listed here on the slide. There's a single best way to accomplish a task that we can arrive at through sort of a rational, um, sort of scientific method, kind of a process. They believe that organizations exist to accomplish goals, whether it's a production or a mission or um, a financial goal of some kind. Um, they believe that the specialization of labor and the division of labor, matching people to their tasks, is sort of the best way to help the organization accomplish those goals, reach its mission. Um, and we're sort of operating under the assumption here in the classical organization theory world that people and organizations are rational. Um, if you remember back to the Frederick Winslow Taylor, he the example he gave was that he used in his speech. He gave the laborer who was loading pig iron product onto a rail car. He gave him more money for doing more labor. I was critical of him last week because he didn't give the man an amount of money, an increase in money that was commensurate with the amount of increase in work that he was getting out of him. But sort of doing more work for more compensation is kind of a rational principle, and um, so like I said, the classical organization theorists are sort of operating under this idea that people and organizations are rational, and their behavior is going to be predictable, and sort of operate in accordance with a set of principles. Of course, we know that not to be true. And so very soon after the classical organization theorists were, started working, the neoclassical organizational theorists emerged on the scene. Now, guys like Taylor, um, um, some of the other theorists were business leaders themselves, and so they were, in a sense, they were a lot like, um, they were a lot like sort of uh, clinicians who also have teaching responsibilities. I mean, they were a bridge between sort of the thought, and the research and scholarship, to the extent that you can call it that, and the actual practice of organizational leadership theory, assessment, that kind of thing. Um, the neoclassical organization theorists were predominantly academics, and so that shifted sort of the thinking away from the practitioners and the people who were actually doing the work, and into sort of the ivory tower of academic institutions in the U.S. and in Europe, in Great Britain in particular. So neoclassical organization theory emerges kind of in the 40s. It sort of remains a force into the 60s. There aren't really sort of well-defined periods in organizational thought. Certainly some people, ideas of that were assigned to the neoclassical school started before then, but it's just sort of a general time frame. But give you a little bit of background about what's going on in the U.S. at that time. We're uh, sort of World War II is ending. The economy is shifting away from one sort of devoted to producing what's needed to maintain and ultimately be successful in a big war, back to uh, sort of what it was before, producing, um, a sort of a goods producing kind of economy. We, of course, have large numbers of veterans returning home, transitioning out of the military, and transitioning back into the workforce. And of course, as large numbers of male veterans in particular transitioned back from back out of the military, they displaced a number of women who had been called into the workforce to sort of help with the war effort. Now, by and large, at this point, um, the U.S. is still sort of a manufacturing-oriented kind of economy. It's really based around making things, and that manufacturing base, or that manufacturing process, sort of, in a sense, lends itself to classical organization theory. But in the 50s and the 60s, we start to see things. We start to see sort of intangible products in the organizations that make them emerge. Organizations like IBM. Um, so we start to see organizations producing things like that are responsible for things like knowledge and money, financial instruments, technology, that kind of thing. And that, of course, those kinds of intangible products don't necessarily lend themselves to sort of a classical organization paradigm. So we obviously sort of need something else here, and this is where, like I said, the neoclassical school kind of emerges. And so their first criticism is not really all that surprising. People and organizations are not rational. Sometimes they are, but they don't always act rationally, and we can't always predict when they are or are not going to act rationally. Um, Organizations, rather, are social systems, and they need to take into account people's emotions. And so organizations should be responsible for providing things like motivation, rewards, whether that's a physical reward like money or an intangible reward, a not non-physical kind of reward like praise. You should provide support, right? That also, so neoclassical theory also gives us the idea that power and politics and sort of political motives exist in organizations, that conflict can exist between people. It also gave us the idea of organizational culture. I know I said this last week, but again, there was in sort of we all, by virtue of having interacted with organizations, we have ideas about bureaucracy and organizational culture and things like that. But remember, someone had to sort of discover, or maybe notice is a better term, but someone had to sort of notice and give a label to these kinds of phenomena. So although we take things like conflict and power and politics and organizational culture just as sort of a given, there was a time when these were sort of new and novel ideas. Now, neoclassical theory um, had a sort of special focus on managerial and executive positions, since they influence kind of the social aspect of organizations. A couple of the readings for this week. The first is by a man named Philip Selznick. Selznick died in not too long ago, just about 10 years ago, 2010. He was a sociologist by training, and so when I say, like I said a second ago, that the neoclassical school is where we start to see sort of the formal academic study of organization, and the study of organizations by outsiders, by people not doing the work. Selznick was part of that tradition. He was a professor of sociology and later law at UC Berkeley, and as I said, he was part of the sort of academic study of organizations. So we're reading an article of his called "The Foundation of the Theory of Organization." A couple of big ideas from that. He argued, so Philip Selznick argued that people are not interchangeable, right? So we introduced the term interchangeable parts last week, but rather people bring sort of a unique skill set and have a unique contribution to an organization. And if you replace people, then your organization is going to be different by virtue of replacing a person. Selznick believed that a person's goals and goals and aspirations should coincide with that of the organization. That's sort of a useful heuristic for thinking about social work, is in that most of us have sort of personal goals, personal values that sort of align with that of the organization. It's doing some kind of good. But that's also the case, if a person's goal is to make a lot of money, right? An organization can sort of use that to its advantage. Or if a person seeks, power or fame. An organization could sort of use that to its advantage. Selznick also was kind of focused on this idea that people and organizations aren't rational, and so he spent part of his life trying to thinking about how we overcome that non-rational aspect of people's behavior and organizational behavior. One of the ways we do that is through delegation, and so we give people a task and then give them the space and resources and time to sort of accomplish that task. How they accomplish it isn't necessarily important. It's simply that they do accomplish it, right? So that's a pretty radical shift from what Frederick Winslow Taylor was thinking about when he was thinking about there's a single best way to accomplish a task. Selznick also believed that that carefully shaping sort of an institutional environment will govern an employee's behavior, and that's one way to sort of account for the non-rational aspect of people's behavior too. I'm just going to pause the video real quick. Someone started mowing their lawn in my neighborhood. I'm just going to shut some windows. All right, I apologize for that awkward pause there. Like I said, someone started to mow the lawn, and I just didn't want it to interfere with the recording. But Selznick also sort of discovered that delegation isn't perfect, and people have different ideas about how things are done. And so there's sort of an art form to managing. You have to you have to sort of balance the science and art of managing. Selznick also developed two ideas that I'll spend just a minute talking about. One is institutionalization, and another is co-optation. But institutionalization is not what we social workers might think of it, where someone is confined to an institution, but institutionalization in Selznick's term or frame is the idea that certain practices become sort of cemented in an organization, and as a result of sort of them being cemented, they become really, really difficult to change. This has been given other terms over the years: bureaucratic inertia, just the idea that there's a process and we have to follow the process, and there's no leeway or flexibility. That's a Selznick idea. The other one was co-optation, and that's sort of given. I give some examples here on the slide. Co-optation is the way in which a bureaucracy can sort of absorb things that will become a threat to it. So let me give you an example. Think about a large company that maybe buys up a competitor, and then as a result of buying up that competitor, they then get to market that competitor's products as their own. Facebook did this with Instagram. All right, there was a point when Facebook and Instagram were sort of separate companies, but sort of both existing in kind of the social media space. And at some point in the past couple of years, Facebook bought up Instagram, and now gets to sort of market Instagram as a complement to its own, right? It gets to sort of control its influence in the social media space. Lots of other sort of technology companies do that as well. I struggle to sort of think of a kind of a social work example, because nonprofit agencies don't necessarily buy up other agencies. Sometimes they certainly merge, but that's usually more out of financial need than say a threat from a competitor or something like that. So I'm not sure that this is a good example. If you have one, absolutely please share it with me. But I guess what I was thinking is that a social work organization might anticipate and train staff on the need to use technology, and sort of proactively assign people to training and learning how to use a piece of technology, as opposed to resisting it and saying that's not how we do things. For co-optation really to function, this bureaucratic inertia has to, it can't be too strong. There has to be sort of a certain there has to be certain qualities to the organizational culture, and Selznick knew that as well, and that's really where, for him, kind of effective leadership and especially at the executive level, that's where that was important, so that bureaucracies could notice when there's going to be threats and take proactive steps to sort of um, absorb them. So Robert Merton provides our other reading for this week. He was also an American sociologist. He worked at Columbia for much of his career. He grew up in Philadelphia in the 30s, and he grew up extraordinarily poor. He noticed that although people in his neighborhood didn't have financial capital, sort of that traditional form of capital, they did have a lot of other forms of capital. Um, they had human capital, social capital, cultural capital, historical capital, so on and so forth, that they used in sort of the economy that he saw around him, an economy that was really sort of devoid of money because he grew up in sort of an astonishingly poor neighborhood. But he noticed that there was sort of still things being traded with and exchanged, much like what would happen in sort of a formal monetary economy. It just was happening with other things as well. So he was part of, among his other contributions, he was part of the sociological school that sort of introduced ideas like social capital and human capital, things like that. So let me just move myself back down here. So Merton gives us a piece called Bureaucratic Structure and Personality. So up until this point, I mean, Weber thought that bureaucracies were pretty much ideal. He loved them, and Merton sort of says, well, no, bureaucracies actually have a number of problems that they create. They are not the ideal type of organizations, and so he wrote that bureaucracies sort of encouraged secrecy. They eliminated or at least reduced kind of personal relationships. They isolated people. So that they were sort of terribly depersonalizing and kind of dehumanizing. They were inefficient, and they sort of conflated rules and values, and so the rules by which things get done become sort of the values of the organization, and ultimately this, of course, would interfere with sort of the mission of an organization. Remember, if the classical organization theorists say, well, organizations exist to accomplish a purpose, they need that purpose is defined by their values and their vision. And if those values are replaced by the rules of how things get done, then an organization is in jeopardy of its vision, its long-range goal being accomplished. So neoclassical organization theory had a number of strengths. It found some of the holes in sort of the classical school of thought, and those holes had primarily to do with sort of this idea that people are always rational, organizations are always rational, and that there's a single best way to accomplish something. It also sort of moved the study of organizations into sort of an empirical realm, whereas I mean, Weber was certainly an academic, but he wasn't necessarily doing empirical studies of organizations. He was doing sort of the pre-empirical sort of studies of organizations, and someone like Frederick Winslow Taylor was really just writing about his own experiences. And so this was a good thing for organizations. It helped to sort of validate the field of study, and it sort of, the neoclassical school gave us this idea that organizations are not sort of overly simplistic and overly mechanistic. There's a more complex set of rules that governs them. And then, of course, it paved the way for sort of organizations that don't make things, that don't manufacture things. And that's really the space where social work organizations function, right? Social work organizations don't make things, right? They provide a service, and that's very different than sort of a tangible product, like like whatever example you want to think of. So it paved the way for other sort of schools of thought too. That said, it did have some weaknesses. It didn't fully replace the classical school. From my perspective, that's okay, given that there's still lots of organizations that are that are sort of in manufacturing at this point in American history. And as we'll get to in a couple of weeks, it was pretty quickly replaced by other schools as well. It did also raise some methodological issues. So as much as it sort of solidified the academic study of organizations, it also said, whoa, studying organizations is really hard, because how do you study non-rational, sort of emotional people and organizations? How do you study them scientifically and in ways that produce kind of generalizable kinds of knowledge and things like that? I do think it's important to conclude here just with a few comments about sort of neoclassical theory and social work organizations. What did it give sort of social work organizations? So if you think about sort of where we are in the history of things, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, there are social work organizations in bigger cities, and governments haven't yet realized that they need to step in and fulfill social service fulfill social service roles that the market, the private economy hasn't. So social work at this point is still largely there's still a big volunteer component. Some of it is professionalized. That's certainly true in the bigger cities. In the U.S. at this point, a lot of it is sort of religiously affiliated still, and as we'll see, sort of in the next period, that's when social work is sort of a profession really starts to sort of take off. As a formal profession, I should say, starts to really take off. So what did neoclassical theory give us? Well, it gave us democratic decision making, right? Decision making by a group of people as opposed to sort of an authoritarian style, which would be much more the case in a classical school of thought. It gave us flexibility in rules and processes. It told us that clients don't have to be rational if workers aren't rational. It sort of paved the way for social work organizations to respond to the needs of clients. Of course, neoclassical theory started to sort of teach us about the harms associated with bureaucracies, and as we've seen, in the news perhaps lately, bureaucracies can cement really harmful and toxic things and reproduce and essentially function to reproduce or perpetuate oppression. How do they do that? Well, they provide an institutional justification, right? And an institutional justification is saying things like, I'm just doing my job, or I'm just following my orders, I'm just doing what organization XYZ says, and that resulted in quite frankly, decades and decades and decades worth of oppression in the United States. Neoclassical theory also taught us that organizational culture can excuse or minimize bad and harmful behavior, and really the way that it does that is if we go back to Selznick's ideas here from a few minutes ago, the way that it sort of excuses and minimizes bad behavior is through that process of institutionalization, right? It just becomes part of the way things are done. and as a result, it becomes sort of really hard to change. It also raises the question about whose job is it to change an organization and a culture. It's hard to do from within because people sort of are molded to the culture of the organization. It taught us that organizations can be resistant to change. And then the last thing it taught us is that sometimes the survival of the organization becomes more important than that organization accomplishing its goals or its mission. Um, if we think about sort of the the logical endpoint of most social work efforts or most social work organizations, the goal should be to put itself out of business. Well, that's not exactly a rational kind of idea, and so um, steps and decisions are made that ensure the survival of the bureaucracy um, over the realization or the accomplishment of a goal. And so what's the right thing to do? Is it better to achieve the goal and sort of disband the organization, or is it more important for the organization to continue to exist? That's a tough question, and I'm not sure that I have a good answer at this point. Um, at any rate, I think that's the end. As always, thank you for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. We'll talk to you later.